Hi, I'm Kaitlin Byrd, and for some reason I love American politics. I write and comment about it all the time, and you can find my work anywhere ideas are sold at Gotham Girl Blue. Here today, I would like to explore something that has been gnawing at me for a while. The focus of our politics. For people who have been following along with my Twitter feed for a moment, you know that I talk about this pretty frequently. The discourse is trash. And I don't mean the media, I mean the discourse. Whether it's social media or cable news or network news or anywhere we are interacting with information about the world, we're not focused on answering the most pressing questions of the moment. Most of politics these days is yelling about tactics and horse race campaigns, or treating our politicians like rooting interests instead of people who work for us. Meanwhile, the consequences of our actions are coming for us every day, and we're just too afraid, too tired, too enraged, maybe too defeated. So it's easier to do the yelling, pretending that other people are the reason there are no solutions, or that solutions are unnecessary, or that there's only one true solution and everyone has to agree upon it completely or we're utterly doomed. But I want to go on record to say we can fix this. It won't be easy, and it could be very unpleasant, and sacrifices will have to be made. But if we actually ask the tough questions, we can do the work to answer them, like making sure we understand what we're giving up and what we're getting in return, or trying to make this pain as small as they could possibly be, and trying to make benefits the greatest they could be for as many people as possible. To me, that's what politics is really for. So here are some questions that I thought we should be asking, along with my unique reasoning for why we're not acting now, and what real answers would look like. How can we prepare for climate change? So, to be clear, as the UN has said and reality keeps telling us, climate change is already happening. When I say prepare, what I mean is for the inevitable effects of what we're already experiencing. The assignment is not prevent climate change from happening. It is stop the damage from being completely irreversible. That said, we are still arguing about whether any of this is real, or whether we can even stop it if it is real, or even if we should try to minimize the effects that are now killing people. And a huge part of that are industries that rely on carbon emission not wanting to be regulated out of existence, like cars, or trucking, or shipping, or air travel. Which, I kind of get in a weird, perverse way. But in the obvious way, it's really bad to hurt the entire world for the sake of a few corporations, especially when they have the resources and capabilities to transition their work towards sustainable energy. Yet we're stuck here because we're too busy trying to save the past for them to develop a future for us, which feels like is going to be the theme of this video, because real answers depend on us accepting that we can't keep doing this fossil fuel thing forever, or even right now. Without focusing our energy on how to grapple with and minimize the effects of climate change and build a society to match, we're not going to be able to answer this next really important question. Don't tell me it can't be done. In the United States, we have more than we can even consume. It's gross. We, collective humanity could eradicate hunger, provide habitable, electrified shelter, and sustain clean drinking water for everyone on this little blue space marble. But we don't. There's the capitalist reason. It's not profitable. There's the logistical reason. It would be difficult. And then there's the ecological reason. It would ravage every last resource we have. But what if? These are just excuses. What if we can sustainably ensure that everyone has a baseline standard of living that includes habitable shelter, food, and water? What if instead of talking about how this thing cannot be done, we just, do it? Now, I'm not saying everyone can dream of having Carrera marble countertops or whatever, but I feel pretty certain that we can afford to have decent housing for everyone. I know that we have enough water and food for everyone. And I know that the crisis around whether or not we have enough is based on the assumption that we have to keep going at the current levels of consumption with the current disposal rate. But that ignores the ways in which we are being super inefficient right now with the resources we have, and the kind of grotesque definition of quality of life from the people doing most of the resource wasting. So it's worth interrogating what it really means to have a decent quality of life, and then imagining how we can expand that experience to cover as many people as possible. Speaking of resources, let's talk about wealth. Not money, but wealth. These seem like the same thing, but they are not. The best way to explain it is that money is short-term and wealth is long-term. Money can sustain you for the moment. It can buy very nice things. It can keep you sheltered and fed. All the good temporary stuff that we want day to day. Wealth, on the other hand, can sustain you for decades. It can buy time and energy. It turns any labor from anyone into value. Wealth insulates you from harm, even if you don't spend a lot of money, because if you need to spend money, you can. Wealth is stability. In short, you work for money. Wealth works for you. So when we talk about inequality, it's important to clarify. The real issue isn't just the declining sticker price of labor, it's the ability to accumulate wealth. So for example, let's take the student debt crisis. It isn't just a problem because a lot of people can't afford the current payment on their loans. It's a problem because people who are struggling to pay loans can't build wealth. They can't buy houses or invest in ideas or start businesses because they are too busy paying back the interest on their loans and have a negative net worth. This is true for everybody laboring under large debts or not making enough cash to have any to spare. In the short term, it's showing up as a lot of scarcity for people at the bottom and a huge concentration of cash at the top. But in the long term, if we focus on wealth, it becomes even worse. Because all of the money paid into debt is money that isn't going into new houses and new businesses and new development and new investment. We are basically facing a wealth cliff in the United States. Or, in fancy parlance, we are facing society-wide opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is the difference between the value of engaging in one option over another. Basically, potential wealth in the United States is going to paying off debts instead of creating new economic activity. And as the largest economy in the world, that is not good news for anyone. So now that I've explained the nitty-gritty on that, what does a real solution look like? Well, we have to talk about the damage it does for a whole society not to have people have access to building wealth, along with the looming catastrophe of our economy dying, because so few people have so much wealth. We have to propose solutions that will help people get rid of debts and make new investments with the cash they free up. We need to stop making massive debts a requirement for future wealth. And we need wages that give people enough to live. And then more on top of that so they can stash some away for investments. Because people would love to put money towards their retirements or into their kids' futures or into their own entrepreneurial ideas, so on and so forth. And the more people who can make those investments, the more stable a society becomes. Wider wealth distributions make for healthier and better off societies. And isn't that what we all want? And when I say wider wealth distributions make for healthier and better off societies, I'm definitely including Black people. Oftentimes in the history of this country, we have talked about shared prosperity, but been speaking about only white people. In fact, whenever we talk about anything good or valuable or cool or even vaguely nice, we have basically meant only for white people. I won't go into all of the disturbing details of anti-Black violence and oppression in this country's history, but suffice to say, it was bad, and it continues to be a barely milder flavor of bad. This gets to the issue of how this is laid out, right? Because people will say things like, my grandparents arrived here after slavery, so why should I, blah, 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 whatever. And what they mean is that they are not directly responsible for Black people being oppressed back in the day, so why should they have to bear the brunt of fixing it now? That is, of course, the wrong way to think about this, because that's like disregarding the difference between money and wealth. It's not about a single moment of violence or an act of deliberate cruelty, but being left out from the opportunities a society provides for its citizens, and then being actively punished for seeking them out. That has a massive effect over time that get worse the longer the damage is left untouched. And that is true for marginalized groups who have a history of oppression going back more than 1 or 2 generations. We are carrying the interest accrued on our ancestors' struggles and worries, the same way empowered groups benefit from inheritances or increase in housing prices. So any solutions need to keep in mind what was denied in the past, as much as the difficulties of the present, because we wouldn't necessarily be in this mess we had been included in the first place. Naturally, our discourse doesn't know what to do with this kind of thinking. We wouldn't be talking about white guilt or white privilege or political correctness. We'd be talking about differences in consequences and effects of past choices rather than assuming differences in abilities. We start looking at our systems rather than individual people. And we could possibly even consider that in the past, people built those systems to create unfair outcomes. So we might have to dismantle those old systems and create new ones. But I haven't given this much thought or anything. So, considering my identity and my political persuasion, you can probably guess how I would answer that question. But frankly, it is more important to ask the question itself, because based on the all lives matter energy I'm getting out in the world, it does not appear that we are having the right conversations, let alone getting the right answers. I have a lot of thoughts about why our discourse is so poisonous, especially around race and inequality, but I'm gonna leave that for another video. Right now, I'll focus on saying that we are not very results-oriented in our discussion of American justice. We are largely talking about feelings and opinions instead of whether the justice system is actually delivering justice, which we probably should, considering what it's called. Does our system of policing, courts, sentencing, and incarceration recognize the harm to people and try to make them whole, regardless of the perpetrator? Does our system create perverse incentives to keep people locked up with little recourse? Does our carceral process rehabilitate and empower people to face their previous misdeeds and re-enter society as productive and healthy citizens? Y'all know the answer. They're all bad. That's all not what's happening. Our justice system does not provide anything good or positive. And instead of talking about the very real costs involved, we are shouting about critical race theory and Blue Lives Matter as if justice is a scarce resource that has to be hoarded. Instead of seeing justice as a practice that gives injured parties as much closure as possible and perpetrators as much opportunity to change as we can offer. I'm always floored by the statistic that the United States has 5% of the global population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. Because it is a sign of something truly deeply sick. And yes, I'm well aware of the capitalist implications and the racial issues and the historic injustices. But narrowing down to just moving forward, we have to define what justice looks like and how we will keep it going in our systems and in ourselves. Because this ain't it. I'm sitting and writing this script just as the United States has withdrawn from Afghanistan, and the country that we spent 20 years helping has basically collapsed into the hands of the Taliban in 2 weeks. So the short and long answer would seem to be, no, not happening. And yet I would not give up on this question so quickly, because the world is becoming more authoritarian, and there could still be a point to having the United States around. Not because we make good decisions, definitely not that, but because we have a choice as this empire collapses to rebuild ourselves as we always should have been. And to recognize that the United States isn't always the villain. We can sometimes do good stuff too. Since the US is facing its own crisis of multiracial democracy, if we can get through this and build for the future, we could set an example of how to manage a big, diverse society with refugees and immigrants and indigenous and displaced peoples, and actually make it work. Most of humanity right now is being offered the simplicity of autocracy, where decisions are concentrated among the elite and regular people are lucky to keep their lives, let alone have a say in anything being run. That's how it has worked for most of human existence, and I'm personally not very excited about returning to it. But there's still optimism in me that maybe the US can show that it's worthwhile to build a pluralistic society, even with complex needs and competing priorities, and still manage to uplift human rights and defend representative government. That kind of change is not easy, but neither was airlifting more than 2 million tons of food and supplies into Berlin over a Soviet blockade in one of the biggest humanitarian missions in human history. And we did that, so I'll place a bet on the United States figuring out our stuff and promoting democracy by example rather than empire. I wanted to ask this because it is taken for granted. In the US, we collectively assume that we are the freest people who ever did freedom. I'm black, That's a lie. I don't even have to refute it. But the problem is it's not treated like an obvious lie. I mean, people talk about freedom in this country all the time. It is just plain as day that we are ultra super duper free in this here nation. So what happens when you reject that assumption? What happens when we challenge the notion of what freedom is, what it looks like, who represents it? What happens if we try to define freedom? There's no telling how to begin. This myth is so deep, we can't let it go. We have become obsessed with this lie, and we are unable to cope with real problems. You can look at everything I mentioned here: climate change, living standards, wealth inequality, equity, and justice, and see the effect of the myths just clouding over the small, desperate light of rational thought. The biggest example has to be COVID. The US has all the resources to normalize after nearly 18 months of pandemic life, and we're throwing it away because our desperate hold on rugged individualism prevents us from asking the tiniest amount of collective sacrifice for collective benefit. So we have to fix this. Not just because children will die if we don't, but because all of our problems are too big for a single great, awesome individual to solve. The situation is not even enough for a team of awesome people, even if there are hundreds of people on the team and they are all equally awesome. It is going to require that everyone be as awesome as they can be for the best purposes that we can all collectively think of, so we can do something together that we can't do apart. What I'm saying is, I think Americans can choose freedom even if we're trapped right now. And that is such an incredible blessing. Maybe we don't deserve it, but we should strive to and use our example to make the world safe for the people everywhere who want to choose freedom for themselves. That's my take on the questions we should be asking about politics. I hope y'all enjoyed it and found yourselves asking your own questions about what can be done better wherever you are. This wasn't meant to be exhaustive or comprehensive, and definitely not global. This was just my take on questions that I think are important for us to grapple with in order to build a better future. Or, something. If this video engaged you, let management know by clicking those like and subscribe buttons. Catch more of my commentary on social media at Gotham Girl Blue and every Wednesday on the Betches Up podcast. And subscribe to my Patreon for special insights and bonus benefits. Until next time.